All right, let's dive right in. Imagine you're a doctor and you have to figure out which of 4 devastating brain diseases a patient has. Every single clue, every tiny detail matters. Today, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're stepping into a neurologist's shoes to solve a really complex puzzle, decoding the subtle signals that separate 4 different types of dementia. So, let's get into it. So, right off the bat, here's our challenge. Take a look at these symptoms. Myoclonic jerking, we'll get to what that is, major cognitive decline, some visual problems, and something called ataxia. Which disease do you think this is? Is it Pick disease, Alzheimer's, Huntington's, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease? Now, don't worry if you have no idea. We're going to become diagnostic detectives together. This is the mystery we're here to solve today. Okay, before we go any further, let's get on the same page about one really important thing. Dementia isn't actually one single disease. It's more of an umbrella term. It covers all these different symptoms that happen when the brain starts to decline over the long term. And this can happen super slowly, over years, or sometimes much, much faster. This is our foundation for figuring out the 4 conditions in our mystery.
All right, it's time to get down to business. Let's solve this thing. To crack our mystery, we've got to look at each piece of evidence from that initial question, one by one. So let's start with clue number 1.
Okay, so our first clue is myoclonic jerking. What does that even mean? Well, think of sudden involuntary muscle twitches or jerks. This isn't just a simple tremor. It's a really distinct physical sign. And what's so important about this? It doesn't show up in most other forms of dementia. So that makes it a huge clue for us, a really powerful piece of the puzzle. Next up, clue number 2, major cognitive deterioration. This is pretty much the core of what we think of when we hear the word dementia, right? A really severe drop in thinking, memory, and just reasoning. And that word major is key here. It tells us that this isn't a slow, gentle decline. This is happening fast, and it's happening in a big way. And for our last piece of the puzzle, we've actually got a couple of clues that involved both vision and movement. First, there's visual impairment, which tells us that specific parts of the brain are being hit. And second, an unstable gait. Basically, the person has a really hard time with balance and walking, and there's a specific medical term for that. And that term is ataxia. Yep, ataxia. So whenever you see that in a clinical note, it just means a lack of voluntary control over your muscles. So imagine the brain's ability to coordinate something as simple as walking and staying balanced is just gone. It's been seriously compromised. So let's recap. We've got our clues all lined up. Sudden muscle jerks, a massive and fast cognitive decline, problems with vision, and that unstable walk, ataxia. The evidence is all here. It's time to name our culprit and solve this mystery for good. And the answer, the one and only condition that checks every single one of those boxes, is D, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. You might see it called CJD. That unique combination of a super fast cognitive decline with those very specific physical symptoms, the jerking and the ataxia, it points right to it, no question. So why is CJD the answer? What's going on here? Well, it's caused by these things called prions. They're basically misfolded proteins that create this horrible chain reaction in the brain, clumping together and killing off brain cells. And it's this incredibly destructive process that causes that unique, devastating mix of symptoms we saw. CJD moves unbelievably fast, and tragically, it's always fatal, usually in just about 8 months. Okay, so we've solved our main mystery, we've identified CJD, but what about the other suspects in our lineup? To really understand why CJD stood out, we need to see how it compares to the others. So let's go through each one and see what makes them so different. All right, first up in the lineup, Pick disease. This one likes to attack the brain's frontal and temporal lobes. Now, your frontal lobe is basically your personality headquarters, right? So the first things you see are huge behavioral changes, acting in socially inappropriate ways, becoming obsessive, or having wild mood swings. Patients also have trouble with language, specifically something called anomia. That's when you look at a simple object, like a pen, and you just can't come up with the word for it. And here's a really critical difference, the timeline. For Pick disease, the whole course of the illness is typically about 6 years. Think about that. That's a slow, tragic decline. But it's a completely different universe compared to the lightning-fast 8 months of CJD. This huge difference in how long it takes is a massive clue for doctors. Next, we've got the one everyone's heard of, Alzheimer's disease. With Alzheimer's, the problem is a super gradual buildup of plaques in the brain. But what's absolutely wild is that this process can actually start 10, maybe even 20 years before a single symptom shows up. And when the symptoms do finally appear, the very first sign is this slow, creeping memory loss that's so different from the sudden personality bomb of pick disease.
Now, the timeline for Alzheimer's usually runs somewhere between 3 and 10 years. So that's a longer, more gradual decline than what you see with pick disease. And again, it's just a world away from the rapid-fire deterioration in CJD. Every one of these numbers, every timeline, tells a totally different story.
And our final suspect is Huntington disease. This one's different because it's a genetic disorder that shows up in adulthood. The early signs can be really subtle, things like just being fidgety, some weird eye movements, or being more irritable than usual. But as the disease progresses, you start to see much more serious motor problems, like bradykinesia, which is a fancy word for slowness of movement, and that ataxia we talked about earlier, all on top of memory loss.
And now, get ready for this timeline. For Huntington's, the typical course is 19 years. 19! That puts this disease in a completely different category. It's a much, much slower progressing condition than any of the others we've looked at. That incredibly long duration is a key signature of the disease.
And this chart, this just lays it all out perfectly. When you see them side by side like this, the differences are just so clear. Look at the cause. You've got prions, plaques, and genetics. All different. And the key early symptom for each one, totally unique. We've got jerking versus social behavior changes versus memory loss versus just fidgetiness. And then you look at those timelines. I mean, they're just worlds apart. From a terrifyingly short 8 months all the way up to 19 years. So why does all this matter so much? Why are these differences so incredibly important? Well, for patients and their families, getting the right diagnosis it's everything. It gives them an explanation for what's happening. It helps them understand the road ahead. And it guides how they're cared for. Because each of these diseases follows its own unique and devastating path. Let's just do one last direct comparison to really hammer this home. Alzheimer's starts with memory. Pick's disease starts with personality. So think about it. If a family comes in and says, "My mom keeps forgetting things," the doctor's brain immediately starts going down one path. But if they say, "My mom has started acting like a completely different person," well, that sends them down a totally different path. That very first symptom is the signpost. And that really is the most essential thing to take away from all this. Each one of these diseases is a different kind of attack on the brain. By learning to recognize their unique signatures, their very first moves, doctors can figure out the specific pathway of deterioration that's happening. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. We've seen dementia that's caused by these rogue proteins, by sticky plaques, and by a person's own genes. As science gets better and better at understanding the brain, which of these areas, prions, plaques, or genetics, do you think offers the most hope for a real breakthrough? It's a fascinating question for the future of all of our brains. Thanks so much for joining me today.